Welcome to Enroute, the podcast of the First Responder Behavioral Health Institute. The First Responder Behavioral Health Institute is bringing together some of the most inspiring and dedicated change agents in the global public safety, psychotherapy, and educational communities. Each episode of Enroute seeks to bring together first responder change agents and clinicians dedicated to constructively disrupting the status quo by tackling the tough subjects like first responder suicide, post-traumatic stress, moral injury, sanctuary trauma, leadership development, critical incident response, peer support teams, and what it means to be psychologically safe and healthy while working in an unsafe world. All units, please stand by. The Enroute podcast is about to begin. You can resume normal traffic on this channel after this transmission. Welcome to this special edition of Enroute. I'm Joseph Brigandi. The main focus of this three-part series is children's advocacy, where we examine how first responders can benefit from collaborating with child advocacy centers during the investigations of crimes against children. In the previous two episodes, we examined how first responders can take advantage of the many resources child advocacy centers have at their disposal to help you, help families in crisis, and to explain why it is so important in helping you help vulnerable populations. On this episode, we examine the question of secondary traumatic stress that first responders themselves can experience during these extremely challenging calls for service. We examine the effects of secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, burnout, vicarious trauma, and its effect on first responders and clinicians. While each definition is slightly different, the results are often the same. We stop functioning at our highest levels, and we can engage in negative strategies to numb the pain while we ruminate on the trauma we helped somebody else overcome. And our own psychological health can start to deteriorate as a result. When we asked the Dallas Child Advocacy Center how they keep their people psychologically healthy while wading into the depths of complex trauma daily, they gave me a paradigm-shifting answer that is going to benefit all first responders. And then they introduced me to the person who helps them stay healthy, and it is my privilege to introduce you to her on this episode, Dr. Elena Doskey de Lobón. Welcome to this special edition of Enroute. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joseph. I'm pumped.
Me too. For our viewers that don't know your background and some of the great, amazing work that you're doing, tell us a little bit about your research, your work, and your education and what you do for the Dallas Child Advocacy Center.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm the director of clinical training at the Dallas Children's Advocacy Center, which essentially means that I was hired on in order to build and maintain an APA accredited doctoral psychology internship program. Now, really, that's just a nice way of saying that in order to become a psychologist, you have to complete a pre-doctoral internship. And so I got hired to be the person to create one of those. And ultimately, there was this need and desire that had been around for a while to say, hey, we need better people trained in evidence-based practices for child trauma. The stakes are too high to not be treating those kids with the best our science has to offer. And so the idea was, why don't we build a training program for child trauma treatment in a place where that's exclusively what we see? And so that's what I was hired on to do. And how I'm with you, though, Joseph, is that when I did my postdoc fellowship at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center in Oklahoma City through the Center of Child Abuse and Neglect, first of all, I got to give a plug to that program. I think it's the best kept secret in the United States for child trauma treatment. You got some of the national and international experts in child trauma treatment there. When I did my postdoc fellowship there, I was introduced to the model we're going to talk about today in supervision. And my supervisor supervised through the lens of CSIRT, which we're going to discuss today. And it was a breath of fresh air. And it was something that I felt my field desperately needed. And so I had an opportunity then to hear Brian Miller, who's the developer of the model, speak and train me. And I just thought it was so good that when I came to DCAC, our clinical director said, "Hey, I'm looking for something in order to help my therapy team take ownership of their own well-being." There are organizational policies that do help people with their well-being, but it can't just be about the organization. And so I told her, I said, "Listen, I practice according to this model called CSER. Let me tell you a little bit about it." And slowly but surely, it really took off here at DCAC. And I really wanted to teach on this and train on this. And Dr. Miller took me under his wing and let me become a within agency trainer, and has given me the green light to train law enforcement throughout the region and the nation in this model, and first responders. And so we're here. And that's a little bit of what brought me here.
Absolutely. When we put this 3-part series together, we wanted to go ahead and do a few things. We wanted to educate our first responders as to how to better help children in crisis, to understand what a child advocacy model is and how to effectively work with it. And then the next thing that we wanted to go ahead and do, once I realized the depth of you guys' work, was answer the question, how do you guys keep doing it and doing it effectively without the burnout that so many people face who are in the helping professions, and acknowledging the high levels of suicidality and the burnout and trauma that our first responders face. There's a lot of terms out there: secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, burnout, vicarious trauma, sanctuary trauma. And then when I asked these questions, they told me all about you and your programs, and then put us together. So tell me a little bit about all of those terms. Are they all saying the same thing? What's going on with that?
There are technical differences among those terms. And I think sometimes we get lost in the weeds of talking through the technical differences of those terms. But ultimately, what we have to realize is that all of these things, what they end up resulting in is impairment of the worker in all aspects of their lives. And from an employer perspective, at the very minimum, what we have to realize is this affects how people do their jobs. We have to dispel the idea that we are one person at home and another person at work, and that somehow we go through like a portal and we just shut down everything and how we act at work versus how we act at home, and vice versa. I mean, that's actually where fatigue comes in. Charles Figley, actually, Brian told us at the most recent training I was at that Charles Figley was on a panel probably half a year ago at this point, and he said, compassion fatigue is actually not an overdevotion to the cause. It's us armoring ourselves up, protecting us from the emotions that we would experience, and that's tiring. I mean, Joseph, you're a first responder. It's tiring gathering all your gear and putting it together. I mean, that's really where the burnout comes in, when we put up so much armor. And we will stay in this work longer if we can just feel the experiences as they come up in the moment, rather than putting up so much armor to quote unquote protect ourselves, because we're really not actually protecting ourselves when we do that.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said that. And in my experience in the clinical treatment suite as a therapist and as a first responder, this is actually extremely detrimental. It feeds into a hero complex. It feeds into a form of disassociation. I have to go ahead and put on the Superman outfit. And one of the things that I really try to teach my first responders in the field is to be compassionate, be present, and be there for people. And they struggle to take the walls of that armor down. Fortunately for me, during my travels, I fell in love with the work of Carl Jung and depth psychology. And he's a very big advocate of, please learn all these techniques and learn all the skills. But when you're working with another human being, please just be another human being. Let yourself come through on the scene. And it has stopped so many potentially violent or toxic or hostile situations from unfolding, because they can sense your heart, they can sense your presence, and they know that you're not hiding behind the mask. Our physicians do this. They hide behind the lab coat. Nurses do this too. So I've worked in the hospital. But, putting on that armor and separating yourself there's a consequence for that. And I think that consequence is enhancing in the burnout factor. And I think that's what you're trying to get to here.
And I think there's a misconception that it has to be either or, right? I think there's, unfortunately, I don't know whether it's been explicitly taught or it's been this implicit suggestion that you either have to be really skilled or you have to be a human being. And that's just not the case. Both of those things need to be true. We're really on the cusp of this AI world where the skills are going to be there. However, the human being isn't going to be, right. And that's obviously the goal with a lot of AI is how do we get to this point to mimic human interaction as much as possible? But it has to be both. And lest we render ourselves unneeded and unavailable. And so that we need to marry the two things rather than treating them as these two separate things. Because, one of the things that I have mentioned of, if you take away nothing from this, it's that when I call 911 and I need police or I need fire or I need paramedics, I want that person to treat me like I'm the most important call that they've had that day. As a citizen, that's what I want, because that's why I made that call. And remember, the most important, I know that there are limits and I know that other people don't know that, but I want you to interact with me knowing, hey, this is a big deal for me, even if it's the 1,000th thing that you've seen throughout the day or the 1,000th type of that call that you've seen in your career.
Absolutely. And that is a part of the compassion fatigue and hiding behind the uniform. This is their 4th car wreck this afternoon. And for this person, it's the first one in their life. And they're traumatized. Exactly. And I'll often deal with law enforcement on the scene. Every now and then they'll call me out to help interview. And a lot of times I'll hear, this person is stonewalling us. This person is not answering my questions. And I'm like, take a breath, slow down. They just witnessed a homicide, okay? They're traumatized. You've witnessed a dozen homicides a year. So they're struggling to put complete sentences together. And, I'll take them out back and sit with them and say, hey, I'm not a cop. Let's do some breathing. Let's sit and talk and stabilize that. And then go ahead. Then all of a sudden, all the words flow out. And this is what happened. And this is the color of the car. And I'm getting descriptions that are needed by law enforcement. But one of the things that their overall sense is, this guy's not cooperating with me. And it's like, they're traumatized, guys. Let's back up and show them some compassion and recognize that they don't do what you do every day.
Yeah. And I think that actually goes right into one of the CSERT components, which is this conscious narrative. It's the meaning we assign to ourselves and the story we tell ourselves about our work before the event, during the stressful event, and after the stressful event. During a stressful event, in that situation that you just described, Joseph, the cop knows what is being asked of that law enforcement officer. They know that I am charged with gathering information. But the person being interviewed doesn't know what is being asked of them. Yes, they hear these questions, but for them, it's kind of preservation in that moment. And so one person's able to answer the questions of that stress narrative, whereas the other person in the interaction is having that overwhelmed feeling. And so they can't correctly identify what is being asked of them in that moment of stress. And so if we can empower our first responders to be able to say, not only do you need to know what's being asked of you, but how can you compassionately communicate, hey, I know there's all these other things going on. Here's all I'm asking of you in this moment.
Exactly. Being present, giving them a little bit of space, and giving them 10 minutes to collect themselves, and letting them know that I understand. And then I get the confirmation that information is flowing and, that they're able to go ahead and access those memories. And we traumatically disassociate from memories on scene, especially when we've witnessed a violent crime or have been a victim of a violent crime ourselves. It takes a few minutes to pull that back into resonant memory. One of the things that we also deal with is how we, as first responders deal with secondary trauma. Our agencies seem to be hell-bent on wellness programs, yoga classes, sending us out to go ahead and do something after the fact. And that is not a part of your model. It seems to be much more proactive than that. Can you enlighten us as to some of those important core differences?
Sure. So I realize I've been calling CSERT twice now. I've said CSERT and I haven't said what it is. So it's um, components for enhancing career experience and reducing trauma. So that's what we're talking about with CSERT. And we call it CSERT because who wants to say that all the time? And so I think before I go into what CSERT, how it's different, just a recap of what is the current approach. And so burnout research really started around the 1970s. And in the 1990s, people like Charles Figley, who's such an important, lived such an important impact on burnout and research and secondary trauma, and Lorianne Perlman, they put forth research that really helped organizations wake up to the fact that organizations had to do something about secondary trauma. I mean, their workers were experiencing these things. And so organizations had to realize, all right, we have to do something. And so what that took is exactly what you said, Joseph, is that it took the form of let's enhance benefits, let's provide perks, let's provide time for people to do things outside of work hours. So EAP programs, employee assistance programs through HR, were beefed up. Their maybe mental health benefits got included into insurance. They would bring in people to do chair massages and things like that, really saying, hey, you got to take care of yourselves, take some time off. Now, I want to be really clear. All of those things are really important. All right. Those things are absolutely important. Rest is so important. Sleep is so incredible. Gosh, you could do a whole episode on how little we know about sleep and how new sleep research really is, and that it's been this thing for thousands of years and we don't really quite understand it. And all of those things are important. But what it's suggesting is that we are basically like our cell phone, and we charge the battery at night. And then we're like, all right, baby, I only got a certain amount of charge and I'm going to let it burn out and then I'm going to recharge it. But I'm going to wait to do that when I get home. Now, if your phone's a little wonky, you probably have to have that charger in all the time. But I actually think that the wonky phone is a better metaphor for what CSERT is. CSERT says this, that both primary and secondary trauma occur when we feel overwhelmed and helpless. It's actually not because of the content. And the example that I like to give is that let's take two people who survived the bombings at the World Trade Centers on September 11, 2001. And perhaps those two people were cubicle mates, right next to each other on the same floor. So objectively, they were in almost the same place when the planes hit, when they had to go down the stairs. Now, had the facilities been available and the resources been available, let's say one of those workers maybe could have been ready to go back to work next week. But there could have been another worker who would have taken several months, maybe several years before reentering the workforce. And the distinction is that they experienced that event differently, and one likely became overwhelmed and helpless and couldn't mitigate those feelings of being overwhelmed and helpless. So CSERT says, hold on a second. If we know that primary trauma and secondary trauma are caused by being overwhelmed and helpless, well, then let's teach skills in order that we don't become overwhelmed and helpless. So that's one of the key things. But the other key thing is this, and those skills need to be applied at multiple moments throughout the workday. Rest when we get home is important. Signaling the end of one task and moving into another is a form of recovery. Absolutely. But if we're taking in a deep breath before we walk into the office and we're not figuratively exhaling until we leave, we're doing it wrong. But that's what we've preached. We've preached that, well, buckle up, put on your armor. You need to be raring to go, and you don't get any moment to recharge throughout the day. You don't get any moment to exercise compassion. You don't get any moment to maybe feel the hard things that happen in this job and the beautiful things that happen in this job. Save all that for when you get home. And if things get hard, just go to HR and they'll connect you to a counselor for like 3 or 4 free sessions with the EAP program, or here, we'll help you. Here's the insurance directory and find a counselor. I mean, Joseph, you and I know as mental health providers, can't tell you the amount of times that I have people come to me and say, "Hey, Elena, can you recommend somebody?" And I say, "You know how you research people? I research them the same way. I research them the same way. And I may know a little bit more about their training, but it's tough. It's tough to find somebody unless you know through word of mouth and networking." And so CSERT says we have to do this work multiple times throughout the day.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree more. And, that is one of the things that we definitely, by putting on the armor, taking that breath, holding that breath while we're in uniform, is not allowing us to connect with ourselves. You reminded me of one of the last critical incident stress debriefings I did for a major police department in the Metroplex. About 15, 20 minutes before that debriefing started over a double homicide, I got in the room, got everything set up, got the circle ready, and I went ahead and I practiced a flow exercise in 8 pieces of brocade, a qigong. And I'm just relaxing and breathing and centering. And I look at the window, and there's about 10 cops like staring through the window. And I'm like, okay, this is going to get interesting. And then when I brought them in, they were talking about it. And I'm like, guys, I'm not afraid to practice this stuff in front of you. I'm not afraid to relax. And a bunch of them were like, it looked pretty easy. And I'm like, okay. And so we diverted the debriefing. We still had the debriefing, but I took them through about 10 minutes of my personal qigong routine. I didn't mean to do it, but they were just shocked and then surprised that they could participate together and work on breathing, work on centering, work on being vulnerable in front of each other. And then, by the way, it was one of the best critical incident debriefings I ever had because they were much more centered and much more available. But shocked to be walking by a training room at a police department and seeing, I'm sure they were like, what on earth is this therapist doing right now?
And I think one thing I love about CSERT is that it is applying the skills in a way that makes sense for you. Right? If let's say that that's not the thing for that officer, right? If they can get on board with, look, I'm on board for taking micro breaks throughout the day, but I don't want to do those things that you were doing, Joseph. Well, nah, man, that's not what I do. Okay. That's fine. I mean, that is okay with me. My big thing is, what are you doing at multiple moments throughout the day in order to recover so that there isn't just this huge explosion that then ends up happening? And that's where we see like the higher rates of burnout. That's where we see people leaving the job. And gosh, I'd actually prefer somebody who burns out and leaves the job than burns out and stays on the job. That's where things start to get dangerous. I mean, that's where we don't do good work. And the goal with CSERT too, that I want to remind people, is it's a reduction. The model doesn't say, it's not the CSIT, it's not eliminating secondary trauma, right? It's reducing it. And I think that is part of our narrative with CSERT that says, I know that at times I probably will feel a little overwhelmed and helpless. I also know that I have skills in order to make it easier, not to make it easy. I want to be clear about that. This isn't easy work, and it shouldn't be easy work, right? We also have to recognize, though, that it can be both. We do hard work, and there are moments of joy and lightness in the job, right? And I think sometimes we tell when you ask people who are first responders, or you ask people who work in an advocacy center, we either dismiss, right? Oh, what do you do for a living? We end up telling them, and then they say, gosh, that must be hard work. And you know what happens a lot of the time? The person's like, it's not so bad. And I think, hold on a second. I work in child abuse. It should be bad. You, as a first responder, try to ensure safety, and you help people when they are unsafe. That should be hard, right? That should be hard. So we should say, yes, you're right. It is hard. And it's easier because of this, that, or the other, right? And that's where our narrative comes in about the work.
Yeah. I'm asked all the time by police and fire chiefs and senior administrators, how come I can have somebody work for me for 5 years, they burn out, they're on stress leave, and they leave. And then there's people like me who've been at this over 30 years, and they come bouncing into work every day, handle complex cases, have a very, very challenging caseload, I am a PTSD and a traumatic-related dissociation specialist, going out and contracting and working with several police and fire departments. And I still am bouncing into work and very, very happy. And as we know with therapists, 5 years is the average mark where we lose therapists. They go become real estate agents, nurses too, paramedics. So right around the 5 year mark is a place where so many compassionate people, and you wouldn't have joined these professions if you didn't have a great heart, wanting to go ahead and serve your community in some fashion. And then 5 years later, we're like, this job isn't for me. So what's going on for the person who is able to have that long career like myself versus the person who's out of here in 5 years? What's the difference that you've observed?
I think there's a couple of things. Brian would tell you that the people who stay in their jobs the longest stay in it because they love it and they love the work. But I think there's more to it than just that. And I do think that that's a massive part of it. And Brian Miller talks about it's not because those people get less difficult cases, like you mentioned, Joseph, right? Those people are still having hard cases. They're having full caseloads. Where I do think it comes back to what we talked about, the overwhelmed and helplessness. And so it's really interesting because particularly in the first responder world, we know that first responders need equipment to do their jobs, right? Whether it's a vehicle, whether it is medical equipment, whether it is protective safety equipment, whether it's firearms, all sorts of things that are needed in order to do their jobs. And rightfully so, first responders, where there are departments facing massive budget cuts, old technology, things like that make it harder for them to do their jobs, they issue complaints about that. Hey, we don't have enough to do our work right. But nobody ever tells you that you need skills in order to protect your brain when you do this work. And so I think that the people who end up leaving, there's probably a lot of factors, right? I think there is some sort of, there's different temperaments that can allow us to do this work well. But you have to do skills in order to keep yourself in the game. And I think that people who can stay in the work have really healthy narratives. You hear me talk about narrative. It's the third component in Brian's book, but it's actually the one that I train on first, because if your narrative is not sustainable, the other skills don't make sense and you're not going to be able to stay in your job. But I think that people who stay in the work have realistic expectations about the work, and they find joy and meaning in every interaction. Because like you said, Joseph, people go into this job with a big heart. And many times they go into the work because of a heart of service. But I bring it back to actually what my dad told me growing up. And he would always tell us, he said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You can go into this job being the most compassionate, having the most idealistic desires. If you don't have the skills to then protect your brain and adjust your narrative when the ideal part of this job is not realized, because that's frequently what happens, right? It's disillusionment. When I took this job, I took it for this reason, and now it's not the job that I thought that it was. And so the disillusionment comes in, and that's a narrative issue right there. When I am coaching in CSERT, I say, hold on, let's think about your narrative. And what I tell people is I say, hey, if you can't adjust your narrative, then maybe it is time to find something else. But what I want you to be mindful of is that it doesn't matter where you go. There will be aspects of a job that don't meet your expectations, and there will be things that disappoint you. There will be things that make you sad. There will be things that make you super happy and that make you joyful. You got to have a balanced narrative in order to handle those things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And one of the things that we definitely see with our first responders that are burning out and the increased suicidality rate is something called sanctuary trauma. And sanctuary trauma being that I went to the agency for help and maybe I didn't get it. I got assigned to desk duty. They took my gun away. They somehow were humiliating or disempowering. And I see that, and I see poor organizational leadership and toxicity in leaders sometimes that disillusions our members. And that comes back to organizational psychology and organizational development. But one of the things that really struck me with your work and this particular book we're going to talk about in a few minutes is the helplessness component. a physician, a therapist, I can get up and go to work for another agency. What I see with our police officers and firefighters, you came up through a system and you got all the way to sergeant or lieutenant or battalion chief. And for you to get up and leave and go to another state or 3 towns away, 9 out of 10 times, you're starting back as a firefighter, paramedic, year one. So the answer is I'm not going to lose my pay, my status, my seniority. So the answer is if I'm working with a toxic leader, I have to stay with that leader and put up with it, which starts us down that road of the narrative of helplessness.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing, right? And that one thing I want to be clear is that is of perfectly not adequate is too light of word. That is a perfectly valid reason for staying in a job. Where, I mean, that's the culture that I grew up in, where my parents stayed in their jobs because they had to provide for our family. And it wasn't their favorite. It wasn't their favorite work. And this is where I challenge people is that that may be the case. And so again, it's both and, right? I think sometimes people get into the situation like, well, the organization cultural needs to change. That may be very well true. And that absolutely, like, it may need to be the case. But wow, if you decide that you want to be somebody to advocate for organizational change, that's great. While you're advocating for organizational change, which is slow, right? That's a very slow process. We've seen it. If we just look at recent history in the United States, if we look at the 20th century and we look at social change that happens, social change happens over years. And we society, the humanity has been battling social injustices for millennia, that this has been going on since ancient times, this power differentials and things like that. I mean, we still haven't figured it out, right? The human condition will be fraught with those difficulties. So go ahead and if you want to advocate for organizational change, that's fine. In the meantime, if you decide that that is the organization where you're going to stay, how are you going to make your experience better? And I remember as a kid that it was just, you kind of suck it up and you just deal with it because work is work. And the work is already hard enough. And the work may already be hard enough because you have a bad leadership or you have a bad supervisor or the city or the constituents don't support the work that you do. That already makes the work hard. But let's not make ourselves more miserable by not taking these moments throughout the day to have our sense of agency and restore our sense of agency in order to be able to do the work.
Wonderful. I couldn't agree more with that. And I really resonate with it because, that's one of the things I'm dealing with in the treatment suite is I can't change the agency. Well, you can change yourself. You can change how you respond. You can shut the phone down. I tell many of my peer support teams and crisis response teams, I run 2 crisis response teams, one for a police department, one for a fire department. And I routinely shut my phone off for 3 to 6 hours at a crack. And I notify them so somebody else can certainly take the lead. I'll be available when I'm available. And I see peer support teams who don't do that. I'm available 24 hours a day because someone might need me. I'm like, all right, that's a hero complex. That's also not taking care of yourself. And that's not helping to move somebody through their own process of growth, therapy, or understanding that they themselves might need to change. And agencies can change. I've seen people who thought that they would never get their agency to grow, who started to become that advocate for leadership development and OD training. And then pretty soon that toxic leader either changed or retired because they're like, wait a minute, the rank and file isn't putting up with this anymore. That one person I tortured for 4 years managed to bring in some high quality leadership, and now everybody's staring at me. So I better behave if I'm toxic or consider changing how I operate as a leader. But even if the agency doesn't change, you have a choice as to how you respond. And while it's difficult to transition to a better police or a better fire department, it is possible. It might take a year or 2 to carve that out. And there's nothing wrong with a second career. There's nothing wrong with pivoting offering classes or teaching at a fire academy and doing other things that give back, because the heart of service can still be realized in so many ways. But it's the locked in the narrative of I'm helplessness and I can't do anything about this. that starts to tear our psyches down. And when I, read the book you recommended, which I want us to maybe pivot into that next and have you tell us a little bit
Sure.
about CSERT, tell us a lot more about Brian Miller, and let me pull up his work right here. And tell us a little bit about his approach and some of the components of CSERT.
Sure. So that's Brian. He is as kind and as groovy as he looks in that photo. Gosh, what a mentor and what an amazing colleague in the field. Brian tells a story when he trains in CSERT, where he says he tells of certain pivotal moments that really woke him up to saying we have to do something differently. And he tells a story about when he was asked to do a professional development training for the equivalent of DFPS, CPS, whatever that is in whatever state you are where you're listening. So he was asked to do a training about burnout, and secondary trauma. And so he said when he got asked to do the training, he Googled PowerPoints on burnout and PowerPoints on secondary trauma. So he gets there, he's got 90 minutes to talk. And really early on into his presentation, a woman who was an attendee raised her hand and said, I know what you're going to tell us. You're going to tell us, you're going to define all these terms. You're going to tell us how terrible our jobs are and how hard our jobs are. You're going to tell us how at risk we are for these things. You're going to tell us what it looks like and all the terrible things that can happen to us if we burn out and how scary it is. And then at the end, you're going to give 5 minutes and you're going to try and give us some stuff to do outside of work to make us feel better. And Brian said he sat there and he thought to himself, oh no, that's exactly what I'm about to do. And so he realized something had to be different. And so, he grew up in the world of being a clinician for primary trauma, and he is well acquainted with the evidence of what works with primary trauma. So when Brian originally developed CSERT, it was actually called Components for Enhancing Clinician Experience and Reducing Trauma, because he's a trained therapist, and he implemented this with therapists. But he was working at a hospital system, and then nurses found out about it and said, well, we want this too. And physicians found out about it and said, well, we could benefit from this too. And then the board of the hospital found out about it and they said, well, we want this too. And so it began to grow, and it really prompted him to say, hold on a second, is this just for clinicians? Or is this really about enhancing your career experience? Because at the end of the day, most of us will experience stress in our jobs. But the beautiful thing about CSERT is that for some people, and I've noticed this when I train on it, they say, my work is where I experience the least amount of stress, and home is really stressful for me. And so I challenge those attendees when we do trainings. I say, then I want you to think about how you need to be applying CSERT skills at home, because this is really an approach to how we go about our day. And as we know, we shouldn't work all the time. All right. That's something that is fundamental. And so some people might be listening to this and saying, well, that's a luxury, right? My agency hasn't figured that out. And I am sorry for that. If that is the case, that isn't something that's healthy. However, it's not just about doing these things at work or doing these things at home. We are living the whole time. We live at work and we live at home. And we have to get rid of this idea. And one of a big sort of provocative points about CSERT is that work-life balance doesn't actually exist. And here's what I'm going to say about that, is that when we say work-life balance, if you really think about that phrase, work-life balance, we're suggesting that those two things are opposed to each other. Does that mean that I go to work to die? For the first responder, Joseph, that is a very real risk. That is a very real risk. So why the heck are we adding on additional risk of mental death and emotional death and spiritual death and psychological death? It actually isn't about work-life balance. It should be about life balance. We should be able to say, I am going to work to live, and I live at home as well. Because when we say work-life balance, what we are suggesting is that Home is the place of peace and tranquility, and work is the place of chaos. And if that's what we're suggesting, why would anybody ever work? Why? Like, why would they? And that's wild. And that doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge that there are stressful moments at work. Of course there are. But talk to the parent of the child who has a severe disability, or the person who goes home and is going through a divorce, or the person who goes home and experiences violence at home, or the person who goes home and is taking care of their aging parent, or the person who goes home and both parents are now unemployed and they're trying to raise all these children, or the person who goes home and experiences racial stress, or the person who goes home to a neighborhood where there is tons of violence. That person doesn't have a calm home life. They are living. And so we need to have this idea that all of our life needs these skills, and work isn't this place for chaos. Yes, it may be hard, and there can be moments of peace and recovery.
This is groundbreaking work, and it is essential to shifting the paradigm and increasing wellness. After having the privilege of visiting with you, and we did a pre-interview before we recorded this, and then I went ahead and ordered the book, and I'm only about halfway through it. Life-changing.
I brought mine too, just in case.
Life-changing, and such a powerful message. Please, let Dr. Miller know that. As you said, physicians, nurses, other allied professionals have come to realize that this is an essential part of their own growth.
Here's the thing, what we're doing at DCAC with implementation, you know who's also getting CCERT? Our development staff, our finance staff, our client services associates, our data entry people and our data analysts are getting it here. Everyone is getting it because at the end of the day, and this is my entry point that I love about CCERT, all of us have a story. And we all tell ourselves a story, not only about our work, but our ability to handle the stressful aspects of our job, whether we recognize it or not. And the goal of CCERT is for us to take these things that we're doing automatically and bring them into consciousness and to say, hold on a second, I've been doing that automatically. Can I pause for a second and realize what are these automatic processes that I've already been engaging in so that we can be less reactive and just a little bit more intentional and deliberate about the story we tell ourselves about our work, and then the skills that fall into that story. That if we tell ourselves, man, today is just going to be so terrible. Okay, today might be terrible, and that's only half of the story. Today is going to be really, really busy, and I know that I have the skills in order to handle that busyness today, or I know the people that I can call when things become too much and I need assistance. That's a much more complete story that then primes us to say, I'm willing to feel the stress of this job. And because I have all this other support and these other skills, I don't have to rehash it a million times a day. And I don't have to be overwhelmed by it because I'm going to take these breaks and I'm going to rehearse a better story that I believe that's more sustainable.
Well, I think that our police, fire, EMS, our military, our first responders can benefit greatly from learning the CCERT model and starting to consider incorporating this into their lives. I was going to say wellness, but no, this is a life
It's
enhancing.
their lives, yeah.
360 here. Other thoughts about Dr. Miller? I want to go ahead and go into some of his components of this program when you're ready. So let me know.
Sure. I mean, the other thing I just want to say is, just to state, I don't get any kickback from you buying his book, so there's no conflict of interest there. I don't even have a darn signed copy of this thing. I'm saying that because I know Brian's going to watch this, and so I know when I go to Utah, I'm going to reach out to him and say, "Hey, man, I need at least your autograph on my copy." But really, there's no kickback that I get from this. So if you buy the book, I encourage you to get it. If you like what you're hearing today and you want to learn more, a couple things about the book, it's really easily accessible language, right? This isn't, Joseph, you can testify to that this is not highfalutin technical language that you can't access. It's really easy to get, and it's actually pretty affordable. I mean, you can find it on Amazon in paperback. Not going to break the bank if you do get it. So definitely want to encourage people to at least explore it and check it out.
Oh, I'm glad you said that. It's an easy read. It's a comfortable read. It's not, he didn't write it in the language of clinicians for clinicians and all of that
Correct.
jargon. So I found it to be very
Yeah.
approachable. And when you're asking him for a signed copy, get me one.
Okay, you got it.
Good, good. Now let's go ahead and look at some of his components. Tell us a little bit about, each one of these phases, the conscious narrative.
Yeah, so I've spoken a lot about that. I'm gonna start with experiential engagement, feeling the feels. And so what we need to know about experiential engagement is this. Workers who engage in avoidance strategy and try to avoid the heavy feelings that come with this job are actually at risk for the most secondary traumatic stress. And that is so counterintuitive to everything we've been taught. We thought compartmentalize. You are not allowed to feel when you do this work. It's not about you. Well, you are doing the work. A computer isn't doing the work. So it has to be about us to a degree. And so experiential engagement says that if we can actually feel both the light and the heavy components that come with the work, we're actually going to stay in the work longer. And so you might be thinking, well, that's fine. Like, look, like I can do the feelings things. But one thing to start thinking about is what are the situations that I've begun to avoid? Who are the people that I work with that I've begun to avoid? What are the situations? What are the tasks that I've begun to avoid? And then ask yourself the question, why? And deep down to that why, the answer is going to be that you don't like the way you feel when you do the task, or you don't like the way you think about yourself, or the way that your self concept when you're doing that thing. So for many people, sometimes avoidance comes in the place of, I don't like responding from the first responder perspective. I don't like responding to those calls because I just think there's nothing I can do. And so we avoid them because we don't want to reckon with our powerlessness. But what ends up happening when we avoid those situations that evoke stress or evoke things that are unpleasant for us, we don't get better at them. We absolutely don't. If you were to ask any professional athlete, anybody who is a first responder, certain stressful calls are easier because they've done other stressful calls like those. Athletes get better at their work because they practice and they go into high stakes games or they go into high stakes competitions, and they know that they have to be able to use their skills in high stakes competitions. So we need to be able to say, hey, we got to feel the hard things that come, but you know what? We got to feel the joy too. Even for people who are in high stress situations, right? I got a friend who's a nurse in intensive care. And one of the things when we talk about CSER, I say, listen, I hear you. I know that you cannot literally leave that procedure that you're doing or that life-saving equipment that you are tasked with operating 100%. I do want to challenge you to say, maybe in that moment, wow, I do have a moment to take a deep breath, or I do have a moment to push my shoulders back in this scenario, right? And so it's about feeling the hard things and the joyful things that come in this work. And it's really easy for us to complain about our jobs. Oh man, work was just so hard today. Well, that's interesting because for 30 minutes I saw you laughing and having a great time with your coworker, which I love to see. But how come that isn't the story you tell about your day?
There you go.
How come that's not mentioned?
Mm-hmm. Talk to me about reducing rumination, because that's the thing that they go to is we start spinning and chewing it over and over and over again. So, what do you guys have to say
Yeah.
about this rumination and how to stop that spin?
If we're going to ask people that they have to feel the difficult things in this job, we need to give them tools to put it to rest. And what happens with rumination is that, um, we experience a stressful event. If we didn't interrupt that stressful event with our own appraisals of it or our own ruminations, it would be over in about 90 seconds. But we're human beings. And so what we do is we experience a stressful event, we have the reaction, and then we think about it and we replay the image over and over. And what we're actually doing is, first of all, we're fooling ourselves into thinking that we're problem solving. We're fooling ourselves into thinking that we're problem solving or that somehow we're caring. Oh, well, gosh, I can't believe it. I was up all night worrying about that. Okay. Did you solve the problem? Well, no, but I was worried. We've fooled ourselves into thinking that because we rehash stressful events or because we worry about the event that is to come, that it means that we care more. And that that is going to be hard for some people to hear, because the opposite of that is then saying, hey, I actually can let this go. I can let this go, and then I can spend as little as 2 minutes. All it takes, Joseph, is 2 minutes in an activity outside of yourself that focuses your attention. Conversation is one of the best things for that. And guess what? It doesn't have to be about the stressful event. If, in fact, if right after it you go, I call this doctor shopping, where you go to everybody and you're like, listen to the crazy thing I saw. Da, 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 da. And then you go up to the next person and be like, man, I was just telling Joe, listen to the crazy thing that I saw today. And then you go over and you find Sally and you're like, guess what I just told Rick? There was this crazy thing that happened. What you're doing, you're actually not processing it. You're ruminating about it. And now you've brought Joe, Rick, and Sally into your rumination. Whereas what you should be doing is saying, Sally, I'm spinning about a thing that I saw. Let's talk about what we're going to do when we get off shift. Hey, tell me about your kid's soccer game. Let me tell you about the silliest thing that happened when I got home today. Let me tell you about the restaurant where I went to eat. Just as little as 2 minutes in an activity outside of ourselves that focuses our attention can break that rumination cycle.
I also practice EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and this is one of the things I'll use in the treatment suite when they start ruminating so much, is because they've enhanced the narrative, added other players into it, and it's like, no, the concept of the reprocessing is to look at what is also true. What else is also true of this? I survived it, or I'm still here now and I'm present, and I only was having part of the story told. The other part of the story is I did have a great lunch with my colleagues. We did laugh about it in the parking lot, and there was some recovery, and I refocused, and I got to go home to my kids. So the whole concept of reprocessing this in a positive light, I think EMDR touches on it, and I think perhaps CSERT maybe touches on it a little bit better.
Joseph, it actually takes us into conscious narrative, which is the third one. And there are 3 components to a sustainable narrative. The first one is it based in reality. We need to tell the truth about our stories. So oftentimes people burn out because they're actually not telling the truth about their stories, or they're telling the truth about their stories, but they're not meeting the next 2 components. The second component of a sustainable narrative is, does it open me up to what lies ahead? Does it open me up to engage in the work, or is it a story that leads me to retract? And the third part is this: does it help me to derive meaning from the work or a learning opportunity? And the stories we tell ourselves about our jobs before the stressful event, during the stressful event, or after the stressful event have to meet all 3 of those criteria. They have to. And we burn out when we lose sight of all 3 of those things, because we're not telling the full story, right? What do we know? We know that if you talk about the hard things that happen, you can get better, right? We know that when you're depressed, if you go to therapy, you can get better. But what happens is that your therapist is there to help you tell the full story. If you just tell the hard parts over and over and over with no meaning assigned to them, and without it being based in reality and opening you up to what lies ahead, that's going to lead to burnout. So we need to assign the meaning to our story there in conscious narrative. And so the last 2 components that I want to get into is reducing emotional labor. Now, emotional labor, a really fancy term, but basically what it means is this. Emotional labor is the effort that we put in to appearing compassionate and caring and competent when we are not feeling compassionate, caring, and competent. And I also think that we make this mistake in society of saying, well, he's a compassionate person. She is compassionate, rather than thinking of compassion as a skill. And compassion is a skill that can be cultivated. This job is hard enough as it is. Reducing emotional labor says, hold on a second. Let's approach our work with radical compassion, giving people compassion even when they don't earn it and when they don't give it back to us. Being curious about why people are acting the way that they are, granting them that curiosity so that we explore why people are acting that way. Being wholeheartedly committed to our jobs. Joseph, you mentioned for the first responder who's in an organization with tough leadership. If you decide that you are going to stay in that organization because for you need the retirement, and you need the benefits to take care of your family, then you need to be wholeheartedly committed to doing that job. And you need to be invested 100% because you're going to do a bad job. You're actually not going to like the job you do if you don't do it 100%. And as first responders, we need you 100% committed. We need you. When I make that call, I hope you're 100% committed. And when you stop ruminating and you actually feel the feels, we cannot be compassionate in this moment if we're still ruminating about the moment before or thinking about just when we're going to get off work. We can't. We can't be, our brains cannot do it. We have to be fully invested in this moment. And when we're ruminating about past events or just daydreaming about when it's all going to be over, we can't be present in this moment. And it's so much easier to just be present in the moment than be thinking in the past or catastrophizing about the future.
I couldn't agree more. And one of the other things that's a risk for our first responders, and I try to teach this to them in their trainings, guys, if you are not fully present here, if you are focusing on something else, you missed a clinical medical sign and that patient now just suffered. You missed a knife or a gun that was somewhere and you weren't spotting it because your head wasn't here. You're thinking about other aspects or the past or the future, and you're not 100% present with this person, and you didn't see and feel their energy shift. And it did shift before the act of violence, but you weren't here. You were caught up in something else.
And Joseph, the thing is that many people are taught, though, in order to not be caught up in something else, I need to just push it aside. But that's not the approach. Because we know that if you push it aside, it's going to pop up when you don't want it to. And so CSERT says, actually engage with it right then. Engage with it right in that moment. Then there is nothing to push aside because you've already dealt with it in that moment. And so this idea of like, no, I'm good. Well, you might not be good. And actually, if you just take a few moments to deal with it right then, you're going to do better work. It's just a reality of it. And our last component, I'll get to our fifth one here is parasympathetic recovery. The reason why I love that it's last is this. Parasympathetic recovery is what you've heard in every single self-care training you've ever been to. You have bought the t-shirt in Destin with like the spray paint art on there in your caricature. You have bought it. You own it. You probably have it in various sizes. And that is that we have to reset and recover. But the key difference with parasympathetic recovery is that we must do it in the moment multiple times throughout the day while we are on the job. We can't wait till we get home. And so people say, well, I like to work out. That's great. You should still work out. Absolutely. We need exercise. It keeps us healthy. But can you take some walk breaks throughout the day? Can you stop and intentionally send funny videos to your spouse? Can you have the person you love send you pictures of your animal and look at it with a buddy and say, oh my gosh, look at what my dog did today? Can you go and talk to somebody about the concert that you went to? Can you stop even for 10 minutes and actually eat and not have this excuse of like, oh man, I tell this in my trainings when people say, I was so busy, I didn't have time to pee today. And when I hear people say that, I say, the next time I hear that, I'm going to look at you and say, you're a liar. You're a liar. Because there's very, very few people for whom that is the case. I can name a few of them, but very few people that you actually couldn't stop and go pee. Yeah, you could. You just didn't. And so take that moment to recover at multiple times throughout the day. And if you'll pull that graphic back up, Joseph, this is one thing I wanted to explain is that all 5 of these skills come together in order to bring our automatic processes into conscious oversight so that we can actually do something about them and work with them intentionally. And notice too, with the logo, the colors blend into each other. You know, when we teach on CSERT, we teach linearly because that's much easier to learn. Could you imagine if I jumped from one to the other, to the other, to the other across 6 hours? It'd be a nightmare. But they do blend together and you're going to find yourself within milliseconds using all of them or maybe needing to lean into one skill rather than the other at certain times.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're to go ahead and recognize, and I think we do need to recognize the extreme benefit that this could offer our first responder community, what do you think some of the unique challenges are trying to get them to go ahead and adopt these kinds?
Yeah, well, you mentioned one of them already. I think that there's the burden of expectation. There is society's narrative, and there's the organizational cultural narrative of being a first responder. You are tough, you don't show weakness, and you're the hero, right? You're the savior. I say here in our trainings, I say, uh, you are not a savior. That job's already been taken. and But even things like, oh, we got to be the hero. That is a huge burden of expectation. And that's unreal. I mean, there's a reason why heroes are a part of the movies. And, now at the same time, you don't have to be a hero, you can be a helper and you can play your role. We just did a training, not related to CSER, but we were doing some work with the juvenile assistant district attorneys, teaching them about problematic sexual behavior here, which is something that we work on here at DCAC with youth. And, they asked us, they said, "Well, what happens when you can't help kids?" And I said, "That is heartbreaking. And there are moments when we have to say, we don't know." And the attorney looked at us and said, "Thank you. Thank you for saying that sometimes you don't know." And I said, "Yeah, that is something we have to be intentional about." So I think that that's one of the barriers, right? Because there is this idea that us feeling is the sign of weakness when I actually think it's the sign of strength, right? I don't know what the saying is, but the man who has no vices at all is actually not as strong as the man who can conquer his vices, right? That's the thing, that the man who doesn't feel at all is actually not as strong as the man who can feel and manage those feelings, right? And so I think that that's part of it. I think I think one of the things you mentioned too is, I think one of the issues in first responder culture is that there has to be this recognition that not every single moment is urgent. There are urgent moments, and those moments I actually need your fight, flight, or freeze to be on in those urgent moments. I absolutely want that to be on, because that's going to help you to enact the skills that you need to respond in that moment. However, we have to be able to recognize, but not every moment is that. And there are moments throughout the day where there are natural built-in areas of rest and recovery. And I think one of the other challenges I think that comes up is that, um, because there is a hierarchical culture in these departments, there is still this fear of, if I tell my supervisor, if I tell my commanding officer, like you said, I'm going to be assigned to desk duty. They're going to take my badge away. They are going to report me, and this is all I know. This is all I know how to do, and so. We want to empower commanding officers, supervisors, whatever that ranking officer is, to use these skills. But I think when we're using CSER with first responders, we really need to empower first responders to use it with each other. And we have formal peer support divisions that exist in many departments, but what does it look like beyond the peer supporters? And it just looks like, I am your peer who is supporting you, even though I'm not a peer support member. And I think that really is where it's going to come in, of how do we hold each other accountable? And as I say with CSER, all it takes is one. You just need one person who you trust, who can hold you accountable to use these skills.
Yeah. One of the things that you've said so much that's valuable to first responder communities and therapists today. And you're talking a little bit about letting go of the hero complex. At a certain point in my work with a lot of my first responders, I'll introduce them to Joseph Campbell's work on the hero's journey. Get them to go ahead and look at it and understand it's mythology, guys. You're buying into a narrative, and every culture has that narrative. And one of the best instructors we have on our faculty is not a first responder. He's a mythologist. And how did he get there? Well, he's on the board of directors of Joseph Campbell Foundation, award-winning mythologist, Dr. Kwame Scruggs, and his PhD is out of Pacifica Graduate Institute. But he discusses the hero's journey, and he takes our first responders through that so that they can kind of reflect on, wait a minute, I've put on a mask here. I'm expecting to be superhuman. I'm expecting to embody all of these things, and I can't even use the word weak. I can go, men are, I can't be.
Yeah. Joseph, I'm smiling so big because when Brian trains on CSERT, he uses the hero's journey as his theme throughout the whole thing. He presents it in 3 acts, and he talks about the hero's journey. And he mentions that. So I'm just smiling because he's going to hear this and be like, yeah, see, that's it.
Good. You made my day, and it also lets me know that I'm on the right track with trying to, shore up our first responders. And feelings, oh man, we don't like feelings. I'll hear terms like, they come into my course and it's like, are we going to get all touchy-feely in here? I'm like, oh, here we go. I promise neither to touch nor feel you. And then the concept of caught feels.
I love about CSERT is that I am not, I consider myself somebody who feels deeply, and I am not touchy-feely. And there is a big difference in that. And you come sit through one of my trainings, this whole thing, right? I hope that people watch this episode and realize, like, we didn't sit here and cry. We didn't sit here and pull out Kleenexes. We didn't sit here and meditate together or anything like that. Like, we didn't have heart to hearts or anything like that. And that would be, fine if we did that. Not really the context of this episode, though, is that CSERT's not about changing your personality. We need different personalities in this world, right? It is about giving you skills in order to uh, just enhance your livelihood and to do your job well. That's it. That's what it's about. It's about protecting you, sustaining you in your career, enhancing your livelihood, and making you the best, whatever it is that you are, that you can be. And gosh, I think we can all buy into that. I think that's a pretty easy yes that we can make to this.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So, if there are 3 pieces of advice you can give our first responders that can help them with the changes that they can make to alter their experience, what would they be?
I'm actually going to give 4. Um, the first one I'm going to give is this. If you don't think that burnout or secondary traumatic stress or things even worse than that, like suicidality, can happen to you, you're already at risk. You're already at greater risk than anybody who does this work. In my graduate training, our supervisors always told us, when you evaluate for suicidality, you never write in your note that there was no risk, because no risk does not exist. So if you're already of the mindset, no, that's not for me, that will never happen to me, that could never happen to me, I'm going to be fine, you're already at enhanced risk. So the second thing I want to say is this: start telling a sustainable narrative. If you can change your narrative, you can change your career and your life experience. So if you're examining your narrative right now and you're realizing that it's not based in reality, it doesn't open you up to what lies ahead, and it doesn't help you to derive meaning from the work or a learning opportunity, start changing your narrative, and please tell a complete narrative. And what I mean by that is this: you have an opportunity when somebody asks you about your job, whether you're at a cocktail party, whether you're at the agency social hour or Christmas party where you meet people that you're never going to meet again in your life, or you're at a media event or a community event, you have an opportunity to shape the narrative for others. And when you tell an incomplete story, whether you lean into the hero motif, or if you brush off the hard things you do in your work and say, it's just a part of the job, why would that inspire anybody else to either take your job or gain any respect for us who do hard work? So please tell a complete story. The second piece of, now it's third. Third piece of advice I'd give is this, and it comes from me as a citizen. When you respond to a call, and I mentioned this earlier, for me and for everybody else who makes that call to you, it is the most important thing in our life in that moment. And so please respond knowing that, even if it's a low stakes call for you, or an annoying call for you, or an annoying response, or nothing's going to happen and I'm going to show up, it's still a hard moment for us. And so if you can be 100% present in that moment and show us compassion, it's going to make the work easier. Because think about how exhausting it is if you're going to that call and you're like, again, another one, got to deal with this person. Here we go. Let me figure out what I'm going to say. Versus, this is the call we got, and this is the call we're going to respond to, because This is how we're serving our community. It's just much easier. And finally, fourth piece of advice, there are moments for recovery. There are. There are moments for recovery throughout the day. You got to find them. They already exist. They're already happening. And there are micro moments that you can build in throughout the day to recover. Not every moment is urgent. And even in the urgent moments, when you remind yourself in your narrative, I know what I'm supposed to be doing, you can find those moments to take the deep breath, to adjust your posturing, to make sure that you bring somebody else in for support in order the job gets done well. But those moments do exist and you just got to find them.
I love it. I love it. So, where can I get additional information or training? How can I learn more about the CSERT model and the work that you do?
Sure. So, a couple of areas where you can find some things is we talked about the book and we showed the link to the book. But if you want formal training in it, if you go to our website, I'm pulling out a piece of paper just because I just want to make sure I get the hyperlink right on there. If you go to our website, www.dcac.org, and you look up our lecture series, we offer trainings in CSERT here at DCAC. And actually, coming up in April, on April 4th, we're going to be opening up that training to the entire community, and it's going to be live and virtual. So if you are in another state, if you're in another country, and you want to attend the CSERT training, it's free. So you can go ahead and sign up, and you'd be eligible for that. And then the day after that, we're actually doing the training for supervisors. The prereq is that you have to do the foundations training first, and then you can do the supervisors training. But that's also free, and it's going to be available hybrid as well. So you would be able to attend that. Now, if you're a law enforcement agency or a first responding agency and you would be interested in learning more about this for your workers, please reach out to me. I'm happy to give you more information about it and see if you wanted something to maybe, if you want to team up with other departments in your county or your city and say, hey, let's get this for our paramedics, for our firefighters, and for our police. Or if you want to team up with other maybe people in your region and you want to explore something like that. We've seen it done in a lot of ways, but ultimately what we want is we just want people to do this work better. I mean, that's it. We want you to be well, and we want you to have a good livelihood, and we want the good people who do this work to stay in the work. Don't leave. Stay in the work. We need good people. We want it for you, but I'm going to be honest, selfishly as a citizen, I want good people in the first responder world. My safety and sense of well-being depends on that. So anything we can do to help, we're out here trying to make it happen.
Absolutely. We're going to put the links in this broadcast to those trainings and make sure that people have those, as well as this 3-part special edition of Enroute is going to be available on your website, on our website, and we also have a learning platform. So you can certainly, we're going to put it on YouTube, your website. We want people to take advantage of the 3 hours of training that we've privileged to partner with you guys on. But if they go to the First Responder Behavioral Health Institute's website, log into our learning platform, we're planning on going ahead and having them watch the first hour, take 10 or 15 question exams, second hour, third hour. After they've completed all 3 episodes and taken the test for each one, we'll go ahead and issue a CE certificate. Right now, we've got that in place with the State Department of Health Services for first responders, paramedics, firefighters. Your office has already collaborated with us to make sure we have numbers for registered nurses, therapists, psychologists. So we're trying to go ahead and still in the process of working that out with law enforcement. Haven't got that CEU in place yet, but we're in the process of trying to get as much CEU available for free for our people on these valuable subjects. You have...
I love a free CEU. So if that were me, take advantage of all the free CEUs that you can get, because it gets costly if you don't take advantage of the free ones.
It sure does. You've given us a lot of your time, your heart, your expertise. You have expanded my clinical practice, and hopefully together we can shift the paradigm in the first responder community to where they can go ahead and grow some new ways of thinking about this.
Yeah, let's do it, Joseph. Let's let one bit at a time. I'm not going to say let's conquer the world. That's too big. but that's unsustainable. But I think one seed at a time is the way it goes.
There you go. Dr. Elena Doskey de Lobón, thank you so much for taking the time to be on this episode of Enroute, and we're just grateful for what you do, and thank you for everything you do for our community as well.
Thanks to all the first responders listening. We're indebted to you. Thank you.
I'm Joseph Brigandi. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Enroute. Enroute is a production of the First Responder Behavioral Health Institute. To learn more about us, head on over to